I started this flying solo with Attorney Bernie a while, and we've basically been setting up our office and talking about why you should be a sole practitioner and all these kinds of things. But I've known these two gentlemen, Gary and Matthew, now since our kids went to school together, and I've started meeting with them on a regular basis to talk about some things. And it occurred to me that people who go through life changes, and that's what basically I do. People decide that they're going to chart a new course in their life, often sit back and reflect on, why am I doing it? Where am I going? Where does it start? Where does it end? Become somewhat philosophical, and that kind of becoming somewhat philosophical about it, changes the way that you approach things. But philosophy and science don't always go together. I happen to think that they come very, very close sometimes, if they're not being synonymous. So I thought we'd talk a bit about this, and for the next few sessions, we can expand on this topic. And who knows, maybe this will turn into something. Both Gary and Matthew will tell us basically what their qualifications are. But it's important that they share with us, just the general public, their thoughts, because scientists tend to talk among scientists, and they write books for other scientists to read. We want to know, how do they get their knowledge, into a wider area? And maybe this is the way that we can start doing it. So now I'm going to ask Gary and Matthew to fill in a little bit, but from what I know, Matthew has been living here in the United States now for quite a long time. He was born in Switzerland. He's UK and Swiss nationality. And he has a DPhil from Oxford, is that right, Matthew? Or was it Cambridge? Correct. It's Oxford, right? I didn't want to insult you with the Cambridge part, but I thought I just needed to make sure. And then Gary, from what I can understand or recall, he was a Harvard undergrad, and then he's got his he's got his doctorate from Johns Hopkins. So correct me, please.
Actually, PhD at Carnegie Mellon.
Okay.
And I was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard and Hopkins.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks for correcting me on that. So, all right. So, could you basically tell us more about what you guys have been writing? I understand you've been writing quite a few books lately. If you could just tell us about those books, and also let us know how we can lay our hands on them if we want to educate ourselves a little bit more and help ourselves through some transition processes that we are facing.
So this is Matthew Kaiser. As Bernie said, I was born in Switzerland, but I was brought up most of my life in central England. I went to university in North Wales and studied zoology and applied zoology there. Then I did a biochemistry master's degree, and then finally finished doing research at the University of Oxford, where I got my PhD DPhil in biochemistry. I then came to America and did some postdoc work in Texas at MD Anderson Hospital, as well as then went to work at UC Irvine and other UC establishments for postdocing. I did do a fellowship in endocrinology as well at Harbor UCLA Medical Center. And I'm now working as a patent agent in a small patent law firm.
I'm Gary Howard, and I was born and grew up in West Virginia. I attended West Virginia University to earn a bachelor's degree in zoology also, and did a master's in biology, which was plant viruses. I then went to Carnegie Mellon University and got a PhD in cell and molecular biology, and then on to Harvard and Johns Hopkins to do postdoctoral fellowships. I spent a year at UCSF as a research biochemist, and then about 11 years in a couple of small biotech companies in the Bay Area. After that, I went to the Gladstone Institutes, which is affiliated with UCSF, and spent 22 or 23 years as a science editor and writer for Gladstone. For the last couple of years, I've been freelancing as a science editor and writer, and also writing my own books.
Okay. It was probably about 15 years ago that Gary came to me. Our kids were still at school together. They're probably about either elementary or middle school age. And we'd been working together to promote science in the local elementary schools, as well as also the local middle schools. And so we had sort of a background together of promoting science in layperson's terms. And Gary had co-authored a book on making and using antibodies, which was a scientific textbook with another author. And he thought about making a new edition because there were a lot of new techniques in antibody synthesis and creation that had come up since the previous edition was published in the 90s. So he decided, well, let's get together and see if we can do another book. It was the same publisher, CRC Press, Taylor and Francis, who are the publishers in Boca Raton in Florida. So we decided to write this book. It came out in 2007. We had a lot of collaborating authors who contributed chapters to it. It sold pretty well. We even got the rights to copy it and sell it in China as a separate deal. We didn't see very much money coming out of that, unfortunately. But anyway, so we did that. And then a few years later, they came back to us and said, would you like to do a second edition? So we did do a second edition, and that was more with expanded chapters and more chapters because more techniques had come about. So that we put that to bed in 2012. And then a few years later, Gary and I were kicking things around and, wondering what to do. And Gary came up with the idea of writing a book about the San Francisco Bay Area. I'd like to expand on that a bit.
Yeah, so we thought we would write about our bay right here because we all know a good bit about it. But the really intriguing thing, I think, for both of us was that the bay wasn't always here. As we know, there's the San Andreas Fault, and we have earthquakes periodically. And clearly, there's a very large landmass that's been moving north. And that, in turn, created the San Francisco Bay Area. But even more interestingly is to think that in a few more million years, that movement hasn't stopped, and it's going to continue to carry that part of California north, even up to Washington State and Alaska. So the idea of making and unmaking of San Francisco Bay occurred to us. So we talked to CRC Press, who's been a good publisher for us, and the editor there suggested, why not do a series of those books? So we did the San Francisco Bay book, and that came out a few months ago. And just in this last week, they published San Diego Bay, the making and unmaking of San Diego Bay. And we are quite literally this weekend working on the page proofs to finish off the Puget Sound, which should publish in another few months. So that's that series. Matt and I don't have anything else right now that we're thinking about. We're playing around with a few ideas, but we haven't landed on anything seriously. I mean, as Matt said, we've been long-term collaborators here and had a good time with it. It's sort of like a hobby in a sense. It's fun to learn about these things. I tell you, I've learned an awful lot about geology and glaciers and faults and things that I never really knew about before. And I will say that in addition to the books that I've done with Matt, I've done a few others with other people or by myself. And some of those have been published as well. And they're by different publishers usually. So perhaps we could talk about those at some point as well.
So here's what really got me intrigued. And that was when Gary gave a talk to our Rotary Club. And so we've been members of Rotary for a while. And he talked about the subject of death, which was fascinating. We were really intrigued. I was really intrigued by it. So, there's a lot that we could say about that. And what I'm going to share with you is just a few talking points that I came up with. And I don't think we're going to get to all of them today, but it's just I want to give everyone a chance to see how fascinating the subject really is. We need to understand the science of the concept underlying death. Is there a possible scientific explanation for what is consciousness, what is not conscious? Is consciousness scientifically evident, like in other species, animal species or plant species, or where does it stop? Is it possible to scientifically have a lingering consciousness after death? And then, of course, we always think of the future rather than the past. We want to know, did we have some kind of consciousness, scientifically based consciousness before birth or in utero? So those are the kinds of things that we've been meeting and having coffee over. I don't know how far, guys, we've actually been able to further this, find out more, but basically those are the areas that I'd like us to cover. So let's get started with the first one. What is, and Gary, maybe you can just give us a thumbnail of what your talk was about to Rotary about death.
Well, the talk and the book were about the biology of death. And, the first thing that, of course, comes to everyone's mind when you hear the word death is our own death, our own mortality. And it is one of the scariest things that we have. Even psychologists point out that this is one of the truly great fears, even of children. Strangely enough, the people who fear death the least are those who are older than about 60 or 65. Maybe there's some sort of, we resign ourselves to the idea and so forth. But in fact, death affects life at many other levels, and that is at the cellular, tissue, the individual we've just talked about, and even about species and populations. So we have lots of death influences. For example, in us, the fact that we have fingers is because the tissue between each of our digits dies off intentionally. That kind of programmed cell death is really important also for our immune system, and we can talk about those later if you want. So there are all these different levels, even up to death has influenced life by foreclosing various options. A whole species that's lost, it goes extinct. You no longer have those genes that can continue that species. And the Earth has suffered through at least 5 mass extinctions over the last 3.5 or so billion years that life has been around. And so those are times when perhaps 90 or more % of all the living creatures on Earth are killed off. So death influences us at many levels. I think one of the most intriguing was the one that I talked about a minute ago about fingers and immune system. In fact, every cell in our body contains the genes for death programs. And the thing that's amazing to me is that life has usurped death and turned it into a mechanism that enables life to continue. And it allows us to develop, to reproduce, and actually survive. So I think that's the fact that life is able to do that is, in a philosophical sense, is a very hopeful thing, I think. It's sort of amazing to me. But that's the sort of the general gist of the book. It also offers an opportunity to talk about a lot of questions about what is life, what is death, how do we know when things are alive or when they're dead, about aging and the genetics of aging. Why do we age? Did it evolve? Where does life come from? Lots of things like that. So it's not just that we die. There are a lot of other questions that the book covers.
So thank you, Gary. What about Matthew? Why don't you address the concept of what you believe consciousness is? Because I know we've had that kind of discussion. I remember us having a discussion as to, whether there may be consciousness in plant life, for instance, and where does it start, where does it end?
Well, I think one thing that is important to understand is that the human brain is the biggest collection of neurons in the whole of life on Earth. And essentially the brain is trying to make sense of what's going on outside. And this happens in all organisms, of course. They use their senses, their sight, their sound, smell, taste, etc., touch, to essentially build up a picture of the outside world. In other words, to understand what's going on and to be prepared for the unexpected. And so essentially your brain is always iterating and comparing what's going on right now with what it's experienced in the past, and essentially building up a picture of what's on the outside world. What I think that also is because there is a mechanism for that. It's making a model of the outside world. I think it can also make a model of the inside world, the inner part of the brain. So it essentially is making a image, so to speak, or a thought process of what's going on inside your brain. And that is what I think is consciousness. It's essentially making observing what's going on inside your brain and working things out and seeing what needs to be done next.
Well, that's fascinating. Now you can see why I wanted these guys to come on, and I know we can discuss this at great length. But what about the issue of when does that consciousness process stop and why? Is it possible beyond what we fathom to be death, meaning the brain stopping, I suppose? That is what death really is. There are parts of us that still survive. There are parts of us that go forward. There are lots of bugs that we have and tissue that won't terminate for a while. Is that correct?
Right. All the body parts die at different rates. Some last a little bit longer than others. The first ones to go really probably is the brain. You look for the organs that really burn a lot of oxygen, that need a lot of energy and have a high level of metabolism. The brain, the heart, those take a while. That has, in a practical sense, that has real implications for organ transplants, for example. Kidneys, livers, and things like that actually last a bit longer. Hearts are more perishable. But it's a very difficult area because I think the underlying science is not well known. I think neuroscience right now is probably one of the very few remaining big questions in biology. So that and maybe the origin of life is another big question, but neuroscience is a really big one, how the brain actually functions in a mechanical way. And that is a problem for figuring out a lot of the issues around consciousness, I think. So how those things are connected aren't well understood at this point, because actually parts of how the brain works are known. But for example, the code, if you will, of how the neurons connect to one another and create memories and so forth is just not understood at this point. And we know that it makes connections. We know that there are chemicals that pass between them and so forth. But how that information is stored in there is just not known. But so that complicates the issue a great deal.
So these neurons obviously are not only limited to as they exist in the brain and the brain function, correct? Can these neurons not create patterns in other part of the body that could survive or create some kind of consciousness after they don't cease to exist in the brain anymore?
Well, I should point out that there are neurons that travel all, the axons for those neurons travel all the way from down your spine out and to your toes and your fingertips. So they are in other parts of your body. The great mass of them clearly are in your head and form the brain. Is there any other consciousness? It depends on probably on how you define consciousness here, because, if I, hold a match here to Matthew, if I want to be mean to Matthew here and
No, please don't.
and start to burn him or something, he will jerk his hand away even before he realizes what's happening, because there are masses of neurons, ganglions at various points that can receive that input going this way, going toward the brain, but they can send a signal back without it getting to the brain. But it's a reactionary sort of thing. There's, as far as we know, there's no consciousness or thought or anything like that attached to it. It's just a reaction that is actually protective, because you don't want to leave your hand in a flame longer than you need to. So you need to pull it out as fast as you can. And it's also, you jump sometimes when you hear a loud noise, and then you sort of hear the noise almost afterwards. And that's because, once again, those nerves, those nerve masses cause you to jump to protect yourself. It's an evolutionary thing, I'm sure.
So I think you can see how fascinating this all is. And I think we've come to a point now when we've kind of, we have a basis. I think people watching or listening could understand what the topics are and how we're going to go from here. I think what we're going to do is Gary and Matthew and I are going to continue meeting and having coffee or tea, in Matthew's case, I think, and see where we want to take the discussion from here. But before we sign off, and I just want to ask Matthew and Gary to tell people where, if they want to get a hold of your books, where should they go and search for those? You said CRC Press. Would they have if you went there, would they have a list of
well, you could go there, but probably the way most, you can always go to a publisher, but the way that's most easy for most people is either to go to one of the booksellers, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or any other bookseller,
and then
just put in the making of San Francisco Bay, for example, and it'll show up. All three books will show up, even Puget Sound, although it's not published yet.
And also it'll show up if they input your names, like Gary Howard, Matthew Kaser.
Right.
Kaser is Kaser. All right.
Yes,
Well,
correct.
thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today, and let's do this again if you guys are up for it.
Very good.
Excellent. Thank you very much, all of you.